So as a product designer, when I was still a product designer, I had this new boss that had just started, and he'd set up some time with me to kind of get to know me and figure out and learn about what I was working on. And so I sat there and I started telling him about some of the features I was designing and some of the features I was working on. But then I kind of started telling him about the other stuff I was doing, like I was running this pilot program for this new Android app we just were launching, and I was helping to introduce some of the analytics to our product as well, so we could measure whether what was working. And he stopped me and he said, "I thought you were a designer. Why are you doing that?" To be honest, I actually didn't really know the answer. It was a smaller company, it was about 400 or so it wasn't that small. But it kind of made myself apparent that I didn't really understand the differences between UX and product management either. It all kind of blurred together. As a designer, you're probably expected to be like an expert at understanding your users, but that probably includes doing user research, understanding customer pain points, prototyping, and just taking that feedback and iterating on as well. But while there's you're probably finding there's lots of similarities between UX and PM, but there's also some really key differences as well. So let's take a look. In product management, I guess the main thing, one of the most important things I've learned is that as a designer, you're thinking about the user, and you are in product too, but as a product manager, you're also thinking about the market as well. With user experience is a critical part of building a successful product. There's tons of other stuff to think about too. You think about your market definition, your segmentation, who you're going to be targeting, how you're going to position it, how you're going to take it to market. There's plenty more. I'm actually not going to go into tons of detail with lots of this sort of stuff here because there's no way you're going to remember all that sort of stuff. Don't worry about writing it down or anything. You can actually look it up later. It's non-exhaustive lists and there's actually a lot of overlap with them as well. As a designer, I guess most people in here are designers. You actually find that a lot of your skills will transfer over as well. A lot of your skill sets as a researcher will transfer over really, really nicely. As well as your wireframing sort of skills as well. And because you're coming from a design background, you're actually probably really likely to already value the need for research and design, and that's actually really great as a product manager, because you'd be surprised not all product managers do, and it's really interesting working with them. If that's okay. You'll still spend lots of time talking to customers and actually sitting there and understanding their problems, and that's something you definitely shouldn't lose when you move into a product role. But you actually need to think about bringing the data from all different parts of the business together as well to validate the solutions and experimenting with new roles. And that's actually the bit I love most about product management. There's tons of other stuff I don't like, but we won't get into that just yet. If you're going to move into product management, I guess the most important thing here is that you're capable of not looking at the problem just from a user's perspective, but to think about it holistically from the point of the business as well. Because no decisions are made in isolation. And yes, the user's input's really, really important, but there's tons of other factors to think about. And that kind of means understanding where your product sits in the market, how many people you're going to try and solve this kind of solution for, all the way through to planning out its releases, making sure it's successful and got metrics around it, through to trying to also just talking about the products inside the company, but also how you're going to share your product with the world as well. And of course, that means getting up in front of people and doing presentations. So I really hope you like public speaking. I'm just going to say something now, and I say this as someone who still sees himself as a designer, definitely at heart. Not everyone cares about the effort that you put into your personas and your empathy maps that you've created. And that's actually really important as well, because an old workmate and I learnt this one really, really quickly at a previous job. We wanted to evangelize design and research at this company. It's a very engineering sort of driven company. And we had this idea that we'd create these little booklets for the personas that we had. So that, because our staff basically said, and our colleagues basically said, we need to know more about our customers to help us do our job. So, okay, cool. And we're actually about to go and get these booklets, these little booklets printed. And I had a thought that we actually hadn't talked to anyone of our colleagues at the company yet. So we're making basically a bunch of assumptions about how do they currently get this information and what do they currently look for. So we actually went and scheduled some interviews, and we went and talked to some of the people in the business, and we even showed them a quick little prototype of something we'd come up with and the thing we were going to create. Showed it to them and they hated it. they didn't want more bits of paper that they could pile up on their desk, and they actually didn't even really understand what personas were. That's okay. They actually preferred reading about this sort of information on our internal wiki, and actually really loved getting up when we got up and told them about what customers were saying and showed video clips of what customers were saying and responding to as well. And that was super valuable because I guess we'd assume that because we cared about the personas that everyone else in the company would also care about the personas. But I'm really glad we learned that because we almost created something that no one wanted. You're seeing some parallels there, right, with your job, right? But thankfully, learning from your colleagues is actually a pretty easy thing to do. And it's actually the first thing I do. I'm relatively new to the area, so I've just started a new job, and it's something I spent my first few weeks doing. I sat down and spent some time talking to different departments and kind of just really understanding how they work, what's important to them, and how they go about doing their jobs. I actually treat this kind of like a contextual inquiry. You guys are probably more than familiar doing. I'll sit there and listen to calls with customer support. I'll watch the finance team go and pay bills or do their end-of-year reporting. And I'll pair with software engineers and sit down and watch them on their latest user story. And I really, really like that because it's all very well for them to tell you what they do and what they're doing, but if you actually see how painful some of these jobs are and understand what do they value as part of their job, it means that you're actually helping them do their jobs better. Likewise, I actually love talking to other product managers at the jobs I work at as well, and also outside, because they all have their own unique backgrounds. Like mine from a design background, lots of people come from engineering backgrounds as well, and they've always got lots of great tips and tricks and other great insights into how best to work with other product managers and the rest of the company. I've gotten a whole range of responses from different product managers on what they do and how they work, ranging from making sure that you involve your whole team through that product lifecycle, which I think is really great advice, through to being super involved with the technical details and to basically tell your engineers how to build a product. Quick note, don't do that. Even if you were a software engineer at one time, people hate that. I was actually once in a presentation and we were walking some senior execs at a bank through some of the research and design we've just been working on for the past 2 months or so. We started off the session by kind of going through a lot of the research we're doing, and we were getting super into the process that we just done. Because basically, so we could kind of show how much effort had gone into these prototypes, and we could really, we really thought they'd be impressed by the amount of work and the amount of thought we'd gone into them. Instead, they were kind of on their phones, they were stepping out of the room to take calls, and then one of them kind of straight up just said eventually, like, let's just cut to the chase. Like, are we still going to be able to launch before the end of financial year or not? I was like, all right. What I'm trying to say here is, do you still think your CFO really knows the difference or even cares the difference between a contextual inquiry and an empathy map? They don't. And that's actually totally okay. They likely don't really want to know either. They've actually got lots of other stuff to worry about and lots of other things to do as well. So in particular, your CFO will probably care about revenue and numbers. Your customer support team will care about helping angry customers, and your compliance guys care about not breaking the law. The next time you're kind of thinking about your presentation or you're sharing some work on something that you're working on as well, think about how it'll matter to them and how it'll impact them on their job. They'll have a much better appreciation for the sort of stuff that you're doing, and because you're talking in their terms, they'll actually be more likely to be on board with whatever you're doing as well. By the way, the next time we made that presentation on the updates to that same group of execs, we kind of cut straight to the chase and focused on the bottom line dollar figures that they'd see as a result of our work. It was a totally different response. I've always been a bit of an overworker as well. I had an old boss tell me that you're always doing so much, you've got to learn to say no to certain things, or else you're just going to go insane. And chances are the PMs that you might be working with are completely overloaded with work and have so many things to think about. Understanding what to prioritize and say no to is just you probably don't need to listen to me tell you about that. You probably already know that already, is super important to the role. So you might ask, why am I telling you to say yes and to take on more work? Well, you're taking on those extra tasks that, when you kind of take on those tasks that aren't part of your job description, people start actually coming to you for those sorts of things as well. And they start to see you as that go-to person. You'll start to be seen as the PM without actually having the title. And that's actually really important because you're building that influence with the team, and you're kind of acting like, and then it's actually much easier to move into that role if you already have that understanding. As a designer, I was actually always really close to the PMs, but I actually sat with the engineering teams as well. I did that for a reason, because if the engineers actually had any questions, they found it just easier to turn around and tap me on the shoulder and just kind of ask. And I actually really loved that, even though the PM sat literally 10 meters away. It's amazing the amount of difference it had between just there 10 meters away. And we're all co-located in the same office too. I didn't mind this at all because I probably knew the answer half the time because I'd been working with the PM so closely. And the other half of the time, I probably needed to know to do my own job as well. I guess what I'm trying to say here is you can get started by asking your PM, like, if you can help out with a task that they've been struggling with for a little bit, or something that they just haven't got around to doing for some time, because they don't have time to do it. I actually gave this advice to someone I used to work with, and I had some data analysis work I just didn't have time for, and I kind of showed her how to do it, and she went ahead and started going on it, and she loved it. And she's actually now just about to start a new product role, which I think is awesome. Taking these sorts of initiatives is kind of really instrumental and really important because it shows that you're actually keen to do the role, and if you start doing them, people will see you in that sort of light, and that's really, really important to make that jump into that new role. You're probably asking, but how will you know when it's right to make that jump into the new role? And luckily, I don't think anyone's ever truly ready to jump into product management. I certainly wasn't. When I moved into that product role, I got thrown under the bus almost immediately with this new feature, or this feature we're working on. Something pretty simple, resetting your password inside this mobile app we're developing. And there was a huge amount of tension between risk and compliance and engineering and security. And I was now caught in the middle. Everything was my fault. And like all good things, I guess you probably know that, you've probably heard that product managers have all the responsibility and none of the authority. It's 100% true. Everything was my fault, even though I just started. But as I mentioned, like all good things, we shipped that feature anyway, and it only kind of worked. It's okay, but thankfully, we had some analytics in place, and we were able to watch and see what our users were doing. We iterated on it, and now it's working much better. Great. What I'm trying to say is you'll never know exactly when is right to make the jump. And the best way to kind of go about that is to just get in there and start learning. So I'm going to run through a few of the different options you have if you kind of think about making a jump through to a product role. The first one's kind of the route I took. I swapped over from where I was working at the time. If you're already a designer working there and there are open positions and you've already started taking some of those initiatives to reach out and to start taking on some of those jobs that people are doing, it could just actually be as simple as asking. I've actually seen this work pretty well on places I've worked before. Again, as long as you can prove that you've taken the initiative and you're trying to learn some of the other stuff that product managers do, it's probably your best shot. Another option is actually to jump ship and to join a small startup that's looking to hire one of their first PMs or a designer, but maybe can't afford to hire both and trying to find a hybrid, basically. I'm sure there's plenty of companies here in the Bay Area that are looking for those sorts of roles as well. And honestly, as a designer and a PM hybrid, that's a really valuable thing to have. You'll be able to use all of your awesome design skills that you already know and able to start solving problems and getting them out the door really, really quickly. Of course, if any of you have worked at a small startup, you'll be thrown in the deep end really quickly and expected to do a bunch of stuff that you've probably never done before. And you likely won't always have that mentorship or that support that you may be used to at a larger company. It's still super exciting though, and it's still something I recommend doing at some point in your life. Another route that is pretty common here, especially with large tech companies, is the associate product manager sort of programs that they have. So for any of those that you don't know about them, they're kind of like these graduate programs that most of the big companies have as well. That you kind of rotate through different initiatives over the course of a year or 2 years or so. And these are actually really great too because you get a lot of ownership over the product that you might be working on. And you also get a lot of mentorship over the while you're in these programs, learning from some really talented and really awesome other people that you're working with. You're most likely working on a cool product, and you're getting to work on lots of different products as well, which is great for your resume. I guess the only thing here is that these programs can also be pretty competitive. I've seen a lot of them hire straight mostly out of university, but it's not uncommon to see other people going into these roles too. But depending on the sort of role you're coming from, it might be a bit of a step down from what you're used to in terms of seniority of the role and also pay. Lastly, and there's probably plenty more routes as well, but from what I've seen, lastly, the other one is to come up and work on your own product as well. This can be super rewarding, and it's an awesome experience, awesome learning experience, and it's actually really great for your resume as well. But it obviously has some of the same downfalls as joining a small startup. It can be super risky. It can also be super profitable in the end, but it's also a lot of work. You'll be kind of swamped with trying to do lots of different things, again, like you would be at a smaller startup, including if you're doing this as your full-time thing, running the business, finding investors, all that fun stuff. If it's your only thing that you're working on, though, you'll have to deal with the whole living in San Francisco and not making any money sort of situation. But in short, I guess what I'm trying to say is that go out and try something, because there's no single way to move into this sort of role. So for me, I kind of made the transition where I was before, but I've seen so many different types of people going into different roles as product managers, and I think that's what's really great about the profession too. I guess treat it like an experiment where you can kind of test and learn and figure out what sort of direction is right for you. You can probably try a few of these at the same time and work out what's best for you as well. It's, again, no right way. And as you're kind of moving into those sorts of roles, like there's lots of other stuff you got to think about, and you're probably familiar with some of these already, like thinking about resumes and interviews and LinkedIn and all that fun stuff. I mean, in terms of your resume should really be one page. I learned that one quickly when I got here too, but as a PM, you really got to prioritize what's on that resume. I've seen new grads apply for roles where they've given me a 6-page resume, applying for a graduate product role, and I think they probably might think it's super impressive, but it actually comes off the opposite way. When you think about rewriting that resume as well, I guess the most important things I've found is to focus on the most important stuff you've done, because you've only got that one page. And as you're kind of talking about that most important stuff you've done, the best way to kind of show that is through numbers and through figures as well. And that really helps quantify the impact you had at that company. Without having those sorts of figures in there, it's hard to understand, okay, so if we hire this person, it's just going to be beneficial for the business or not. As well as this, think about it as a user as well. Is this resume actually easy to read? I'd probably lose the photo. I've seen some very interesting photos on resumes before. It's definitely not necessary, especially if you've just got that one page. This is my personal advice, but I'd probably lose the professional statements as well. I see a lot of resumes that say I'm a driven, hardworking, results-orientated person. And everyone says that. It doesn't mean that they actually are. If you can show that through the work that you've done and the experience that you have. When you think you've done your resume, I think the best thing to do is always seek feedback on what you're doing as well. And I, of course, sought feedback from other product managers I knew. If you don't know any of me, feel free to send it to me. I've done that before, and I'm happy to help out too. I probably had about 6 iterations of my own resume when I moved here, and I was already a product manager. Your resume is kind of really the only thing that might stand between you and potentially several hundred other people when you're interviewing for that new role. And it's really got to be great. I guess the sort of stuff that goes into it also needs to be reflected in your LinkedIn as well. I've seen resumes that have massive gaps that won't apparent on the resume but actually happened on LinkedIn, and it just kind of becomes a bit of a decision of oh, what's this person really worked on? What have they really done? So just try and make sure it's consistent and make sure you're easily findable. So if you have a recruiter that's found your resume, it's going to look you up, everything matches, everything makes sense, and they can find you and reach out to you. So on the interview, I'm actually not going to go too much into depth of this. There's plenty of other talks about this, actually at product school as well. And a very popular book actually dedicated to this topic by Gal McCormick called Cracking the PM Interview. Some of you guys might have already heard of it as well. I read that thing back to back and treated interviewing like a full-time sport, full-time job. If you want the quick version, she's actually done a talk at product school, and you can look it up on YouTube. So it's actually a really great way to get started, because the questions they ask are interesting. The teacher's going to ask those sort of questions that you might get in an interview. You don't get many of them now, and you might hear ones like, how many ping pong balls would fit into a car? In that scenario, they actually don't care. They just want to see how you think, and it's more of an estimation sort of exercise. And you might see some of those questions through to your classic data analysis sort of work. They might make you do a take-home, or they might even give you a design challenge. I've had those before, and hopefully as designers, that's something that you could be really great at too. The actual interviews can be pretty brutal. When I was coming here and doing all of my on-sites, they're full-day things. And basically, I guess what's important is to really take time to prepare for them. As I mentioned before, when I was interviewing, I treated it like my full-time job to prepare for these sorts of interviews, because like me, chances are you'll fail tons of them. I luckily had a few offers by the end of it, but I'd also failed a few as well. I burnt through some good ones pretty quickly at the beginning. Stuff happens, but I guess you'll only know and get better by actually having that real practice as well. Applying to a new role is kind of like applying to any other role. Product management isn't special in that sort of regard. Make sure you're kind of adjusting your resume and your LinkedIn profile, again, to sound like you're actually already doing the job and already a product manager. And really make sure you spend the time to prepare for those interviews, because it'll happen eventually. You start at the bottom and now you're here. You say that, yep, I've interviewed and I've gotten the job. What's next? Here's a few things that I learned, the hard way, of course, that could make your life a little bit easier on the other side, hopefully. When I first moved into that product role, I still wanted to design. I still saw myself as a designer. In fact, I still do. And I found myself wanting to get super involved with the design process. And that included kind of being involved with ideation sessions and jumping into Sketch and prototyping things, kind of just like I used to do, basically. And that earned me a metaphorical kick in the pants by the designer I was working with at the time. She pulled me aside one day and said, straight up, "Why are you doing my job? Don't you trust me?" I hadn't actually thought of it like that before. Sounds obvious now, but if you try and micromanage your workmates' jobs, you're going to find probably one of two things, if not both of them. The first thing is, if you're trying to do their job as well as your own, you're probably going to do a really terrible job because you've just got so many things on your plate. And the second thing you're probably going to find is you're going to alienate your workmates and they're going to hate you for it. I probably mentioned earlier that when I was working and I'm running my own business, I had clients tell me all the time how to design and how to do my job. And of course, I hated it. That's exactly what they'll feel like. I know I just kind of told you to just take on and do more and more work and take on new jobs and take on new responsibilities. But when you've swapped to that product role, that in some ways kind of stops now. You'll have plenty of stuff to do. And it'll all be fun stuff. You don't have time to take on other people's work as well. Instead, you should be spending your time thinking about the business and learning about the business, and kind of find out what sort of the big picture goals you have for the business and its strategy, because your team will be looking to you to help them understand, we've got this big picture strategy of the company here and we've got the work that we're doing. How do those kind of align? And that's super important because no one wants to work on something that's useless, and they'll be looking to you to understand, what are we working on now and how does that matter in the grand scheme of things? They'll be looking for you to do that, and you'll be that link between the company strategy and what everyone's working on. You should really keep spending your time talking to customers and understanding their problems. I find that you're probably never too important, you're never too busy to go and spend time listening to customers, even if you move to a product role. You're never too important to hear people complaining about your product, and you to do something about it as well. Most importantly, I also keep reading everything I can. I spend lots of my time reading Marty Kagan's Silicon Valley Product Group set of blogs. I read stuff by Eric Reed and Steve Blank and everyone I can on Medium as well. And it's something I do in my spare time. And I like it because I'm always experimenting with new approaches and new ways of approaching problems. And that kind of helps me better myself as well. There's no one way of doing things. When you're in that new role, it's really, really important to build your trust with the team because you probably already understand, you've probably read some books and already know that as a product manager, you of course don't manage the team, you manage the product. And that's actually a really great thing. But it does mean that if you don't put the time into these sorts of relationships with people in your team, why would they listen to you? And why would they trust you? You're spending 40 plus hours a week with these people, and if you don't get to know them and you don't get them to trust you, then you're probably not going to be doing the best work of your life. It's super, super important. So as a quick recap, some of the things we learned tonight around users, what's really important here is that understanding users is actually only part of the puzzle. Thankfully, we've already got a head start as designers, but if you're building a successful product, knowing that there are other things to fill your knowledge gaps and brush up on is important. We now know that the trick to talking with colleagues is to understand their needs like you would with a user interview, and to speak to them about your work, and basically understand how it will matter to them best. We looked at how to get started with some of the small product tasks, about knowing when to jump in and help your PM. And how to share that sort of knowledge and ownership with the rest of your team as well. We looked at some of the high-level directions you can take when you're actually moving into a product role, the pros and cons of sticking with your existing business versus going and moving to a new business and finding your own way there. We also know now that when you move into a new role, some of the things you should probably think about doing is to stop being a designer, but to still keep talking to customers and making sure you understand the business and its objectives really, really well, and to share that with your team. Lastly, we looked at some of the basics of improving your resume, quantifying your achievements, and being really brutal about prioritizing its content, and spending time brushing up on your interview techniques with the book Cracking the PM Interview. More importantly, the main takeaway from here tonight is that you'll always be learning. There's no right way into products, and to just do it. Thank you. So I've kind of whizzed through that probably relatively quickly, and I probably didn't entertain too many questions through the middle there. Has anyone got any questions?
You touched it a little bit in your presentation, but like coming from a designer background, did you find yourself building a better relationship with designers when working with them? Because like you speak the same language, you have eye for design, and then because usually like I found my designers like always have tension with PMs and saying they don't know design, and then yeah. So
in general, yeah, I definitely have. I found that a lot at my new role at Xero. That I found working with the designers and researchers pretty easy, and they've found it pretty easy working with me, I hope, as well. At least they've told me that. And in my old job, the same thing as well. I guess the most important thing is that even though you'll probably have slightly different approaches to really, really trust them and say, look, if they've got evidence to support the sort of design they're going with, is to trust them as long as it aligns with the direction that the business is going in as well. So yeah, I found it actually way easier working with designers and researchers in that regard too. The same way I found it really easy to work with software engineers because I sat in the team. I understood the team really well. I actually understand a lot about how mobile apps work now, and actually made it really valuable for helping me make decisions as a designer, but also as a product manager. Yeah. I think that's why it's a lot of the overarching things of understanding what problem we should solve. Designers actually have a lot of that sort of stuff in their toolkit. So I think that coming from a design background actually makes tons of sense to move into product. So it's actually really valuable sort of experience. Good question.
How do you like overcome, like, where I work in very engineering centric, so like our APM code for is only open to engineers, like hard stop.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure if I like work it, I can figure it out, but how have you run into that and how do you overcome that?
Yeah, it's very tricky. I think it really depends on this. I probably have an idea of what that company is as well, because I think it's funny when you think about the sort of company that you work at. I always think about who founded the company and who started the company. So the last company I worked at was a very engineering focused company as well, and the founders were software engineers. And a lot of Bay Area companies founded by software engineers. But I also think about other companies like Airbnb who had two designers as their founders as well. And what I'm trying to say here is you look at the company and the culture and who they hire. And especially for product roles, I think that if you're at a company where they only really want someone who's come from an engineering background, especially going into these roles, it's definitely an uphill battle. Yes, you definitely can learn some of the things they're looking for, but it may be too much of an uphill battle to deal with. I know that some of those interviews, I've done some of them too, they ask you for questions that really should be tackled more by a software engineer, like algorithm sort of style questions. And they'll ask you to write pseudocode on the board, and you'll probably be maybe okay with that, but it's definitely more of an uphill battle, and I think it could be easier to think about a role at a different company and come back in as a more experienced product manager to that company later on when those technical details either may not matter as much, or you're in a more senior position that it just doesn't really matter anymore. I've come across that too, and friends of mine that used to be software engineers, in fact, the guy I was talking about, he's probably interviewing at that company right now, and he's scared about doing those interviews because he just hasn't touched code and in like 8 or 9 years. I think that's a tricky one, and I think those sorts of things are probably really tricky if they don't come from top down. That's just from my experience, but yeah.
So what does that mean overall? I ran into a situation where it was also, let's just be really clear, the PM they're looking for, they want a former full stack engineer in that role. Is it they want someone who can speak to the engineers? Do they want someone to manage the politics of engineering decisions? What is under that?
That's actually a really great question too, because I think there's an assumption that like with a product manager, because classically they have come from software engineering backgrounds, that they really need to be into the weeds and to know everything about the product, and you'll be working with mostly, I mean, depending on the sort of role you're in, if you're in more of a product owner role, then you'll definitely be working more with software engineers. So product manager, you may or may not be. I think that probably stems from probably more classical history, and it probably more depends on the sort of product that you might be working on too. So when I was applying for jobs and looking for a new role here, I only applied for the roles that I thought I'd actually be good at. So ones that look at, that are more designs and experience sort of led companies, but also types of companies, types of roles that I was looking at. So what I do at Xero, I actually look after an experience. I find that if they're asking for PMs that come from really technical backgrounds, they might be interviewing them to work as the PM of an API or the PM of an integration. Where that experience will actually be much more helpful. One of the colleagues I work with is a PM, and he's got a data science background and a software engineering background, and he's working on a data product. Whereas if I went in and did that job, I'd be useless and terrible. So I think it really comes down to the types of roles that they're hiring for. I don't think that's probably true for everyone. I'd say that maybe at these really big companies, it's actually really hard to be really nuanced, and especially when you're working with, if they have like thousands of recruiters, they say, here are the requirements. If they don't have any of these, then just scrap them. It probably means they're losing a lot of good talent as well. But I'd say in general, they're probably after a skill set, I'd say, that more lends itself to an engineering sort of style position or of a product manager position.
Why would you recommend a UXer go the direction of a PM versus continuing up that discipline, getting it, basically taking on a design leadership role and moving up the ladder to say VP of design or
Yep.
something like that?
That's a really good point, because I've actually had that exact, in fact, probably about 6 months ago, I had that exact same thought. Like, where do I actually want to go in my career? Because, as I mentioned before, I fell into products. It originally wasn't by choice. And I had to have that same thought of, okay, I'm a designer, and I was actually the design lead as well. And I had to think about, well, do I want to be a principal designer? I kind of see a few different avenues you can take. Similar to software engineering, you can go down the principal designer route, be a really, really great designer. You can go down the design management sort of route, where you probably come from a design background, but you really know what a designer in your team needs and what design is at a management sort of level, and how to guide the whole company through design. And then there's product management, which is obviously has some overlap, but completely different. I don't think there's any, again, I don't think there's any one way. It's really, I kind of brought it down to, what do I actually like doing? I found that more and more as myself, like, I actually kind of liked being a designer and going into the tools and actually designing stuff, but I found the sort of stuff I didn't like kind of outweighed what I wanted to be as a product manager. So I was more of a generalist product designer. I was master of, jack of all tools and master of none. So I could do a wide breadth of things, but I wasn't particularly good at any of them. And for example, I didn't love doing the UI side of speccing things out and handing them over to developers and that sort of stuff. And that, every time I had to do that sort of stuff, I really, really hated it, actually. But the sort of stuff I really, really loved was is just solving problems. Solving problems that customers have in front of them. And if you're thinking about the sort of role that you want to be doing, I actually didn't mind. So even though I loved kind of getting into the design stuff, if I hadn't worked on it, or if I hadn't put my touch on the design, I actually didn't really matter. I didn't mind at all. The most value I got out of it and the most reward I got out of it is just seeing something that the whole team had worked on and shipped and people loved. I didn't actually need to put my touch on it. So I saw that as a hint that maybe I don't need to be a designer. I'm still solving problems, and they're good problems, but I actually don't have to be involved with every little detail. And that was probably the hint to me that, oh, maybe product management's better. It's super rewarding, and I find that as a product manager, your day is much more varied, and I've got a very short attention span, so I really like that too. As a designer, meant that sometimes I had my eyes focused on doing one thing for like 3 or 4 weeks at a time, just one thing, and I got distracted really easily, and I didn't love it all the time. So those are some of the reasons I moved into products, and I don't know if that resonates with anyone else, but I know that, like, as a designer, it's really tricky to understand what sort of route do I want to go down. That's just how I fell into it, I guess.
Would you recommend, like, a young designer to get some experience in product design before moving into product management?
I've actually had this question raised to me before. This person reached out to me randomly on LinkedIn, actually. She saw Xero and said, oh, Xero have nice design. How do I become a PM at Xero? And her idea was, oh, should I go and be a designer first? I guess my question is, what's your end goal? Like, what do you actually want to be? Maybe you don't know yet, but...
I'd like to own my own business, but I'd like to get some experience first.
Gotcha. So when you say you own your own business, is that build your own products, or is that consulting, or...
Yes, most likely product.
Product. Okay.
But a little bit farther down the road.
Yeah, that's cool. I think I guess I asked that same question to the same person I was asking, and she said, oh, but it looks like design will help me get into product, right? I'm like, yeah, it will. It's definitely a valuable experience, but I think there are probably, while it's a really good way to get into products, I think if your end goal is to run your own company, and actually product management's a really great lead into that. You probably hear a lot of the CEO of the product sort of thing. I don't know how much I buy into the CEO of the product, but it definitely gives you... Sorry?
I wish you'd never been said.
Yeah, it's. I don't think that's quite true, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of understanding, as I mentioned before, the market and everything else, and think about pricing and think about bringing the whole team together. And I see the CEO's role as more like pushing the whole company in the right direction. So I think design's probably a good way to get into it, but if your end goal is product, then I'd probably think about how you can move into a product role earlier so you can get that experience so that your end goal, and it will be more valuable in the end. So I'm trying to say is that it's not going to be a bad experience, but if you spend the next 10 years wanting to be a designer and then you swap over to product, it's not going to be a bad experience, but you could have spent those 10 years in product already, and it might have been an easier jump to running your own business in the future. Then again, to be honest, I have 8 or 9 years of experience as a designer. Product's actually still relatively new to me, so I'm still learning now. I probably would have been a much better product manager if I had have started 8 years ago, but things happen. Cool.
Do you ever find yourself losing satisfaction that when you were a designer, you kind of completed a project and you got the great, versus moving on from thing to thing to thing?
So I'm interested, you said moving on from thing to thing to thing, I guess it really depends on where you work. The last product I worked on was, I worked on a mobile banking app. So we owned that, and we also owned the web channel as well. And we worked on the whole thing, and there were lots and lots of features coming in and out. But I never had that, just finishing that and then moving on to the next thing. In some ways so when I was consulting, for example, I mentioned talking about building this, designing and building this business analytics platform. As a consultant, I definitely had that. Okay, you finish this job, you go on to the next one. What I learned about consulting is I didn't love that, because I didn't love that you come in halfway through, you design some stuff, and then you leave, and you never find out what the end result was. And you see it launch and oh, cool, I saw it. There's a picture of me standing next to the product I launched, and it's in billboards and stuff. That was really cool, but I didn't know it launched until 2 months after it had actually released, and I had to I asked some of my old colleagues oh, so how many people are using that product now? And they told me, I'm oh, that's great. But you lose a lot of the knowledge of what happens when you launch. And if you're at a product sort of company, because it's pretty rare that you kind of finish that thing and move on to the next thing and you never come back to that thing at all. What I really love at a product company is that you work on something and you launch it, and then you find out, oh, did that work or did that not work? And then you iterate based on that. So it's pretty rare that you kind of, I found, depending on where you work again, is that you launch something and you never look at it again. There's probably likely to be some work. It may not be as detailed or isn't in as much depth as you were before. But again, it really depends on the sort of product you work on. So if you're working on a company that the whole product centered around one product, I think Lyft actually just redesigned their mobile app. That would have been at least 6 months to a year in the making. And now that they launched that, it's not like they're going to leave it and never touch it again, because Lyft's redesigned their app probably 4 times. They're going to look at it and understand what's working and what's not. Okay, that didn't quite work. We need to redesign that bit a little bit. So I think I really find a lot of value in kind of the continuing process and not rolling off projects, but kind of juggling lots of things and coming back to things as well. And as a designer, I really love that. And as a product manager, the same sort of thing, because you're always measuring experiments. You might have launched this thing and you've got some analytics in there, and it's really great when things work and humbling when things don't.